Throughout history, religion and power have been deeply intertwined. In the case of the Catholic Church, this relationship was strengthened during the Renaissance, an era marked both by cultural flourishing and strict control over thought. But how did a religious institution manage to influence not only faith but also art, science, and politics? The Renaissance was a period of great intellectual advances, but also of strong censorship. Many thinkers, scientists, and artists saw their ideas suppressed or modified to fit the Church's doctrines. Works were banned, scientific studies condemned, and artists subjected to restrictions. Despite being a time of significant progress, it was also an era in which power sought to dictate the boundaries of knowledge. To fully understand how the Catholic Church exerted this control, it's essential to comprehend the context of its power during the Renaissance. Contrary to what one might imagine, the Church was not merely a religious institution. It was a political force, an economic powerhouse, and a cultural authority. It had an expansive influence over all layers of society. By the end of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the Renaissance, Catholicism was deeply embedded in European life. The Church was the primary institution responsible for education. It managed schools, universities, and libraries, and it defined what could and could not be taught. Latin, the language of the Church, was also the language of scholars, further limiting access to learning and keeping knowledge within a small elite circle. In addition to its educational power, the Church maintained close ties with monarchs and political rulers. Papal approval often determines the legitimacy of kings and emperors. Rulers relied on the Church to maintain social order, and the Church, in turn, reinforced its dominance through laws, papal bulls, and alliances. It was a relationship of mutual dependence, where both parties worked to preserve the status quo. Economically, the Church wielded immense power. It owned vast tracts of land, controlled tithes and taxes, and profited from the sale of indulgences. These resources allowed the Church to influence governments and fund massive projects, including the construction of grand cathedrals and the commissioning of art. The Church's financial clout enabled it to be both a spiritual and temporal authority. It was within this complex web of power that the Renaissance emerged. The Renaissance brought with it a spirit of inquiry, a revival of classical knowledge, and a new emphasis on human potential. However, these ideas often clashed with Church doctrine, creating a tension between innovation and tradition. The Church viewed many of these new ideas as threats to its authority. One of the primary tools the Catholic Church used to maintain its grip on knowledge was censorship. This censorship extended to anything considered dangerous, subversive, or heretical. The most prominent expression of this control was the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, or Index of Forbidden Books. Established in the 16th century, the index listed publications that were banned due to their content. Books that contradicted Church teachings or promoted ideas deemed immoral were blacklisted. The index included works by many of the era's most important thinkers: Galileo, Copernicus, Machiavelli, and Erasmus, among others. These books were seen as threats to orthodoxy and were removed from public access. In some cases, possession of a banned book could lead to investigation by the Inquisition, the Church's religious tribunal. The Inquisition itself was another major mechanism of control. This institution prosecuted individuals accused of heresy, often subjecting them to interrogation, torture, and public punishment. The most notorious case is perhaps that of Giordano Bruno, an Italian philosopher who proposed that the universe was infinite and contained many worlds. His ideas went far beyond the geocentric model favored by the Church. In 1600, after years of imprisonment and trial, Bruno was burned at the stake. Another iconic case is that of Galileo Galilei. Galileo built on Copernican theory using telescopic observations to support the idea that the Earth revolved around the Sun. This heliocentric model contradicted the geocentric view upheld by Church authorities. In 1633, Galileo was tried by the Inquisition, forced to recant his findings, and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. His book was banned for over 100 years. Despite such repressive measures, the desire for knowledge persisted. The very act of banning books and silencing thinkers often increased interest in their ideas. The attempts to restrict thought, paradoxically, ignited a broader movement toward intellectual liberation that would culminate in the Enlightenment. In the realm of the arts, the Catholic Church played a dual role as both benefactor and censor. During the Renaissance, art became one of the most important forms of cultural expression. The Church recognized the power of visual imagery and sought to harness it for religious and ideological purposes. By sponsoring artists, the Church could shape public perception and reinforce its values. The list of artists commissioned by the Church reads like a who's who of Renaissance genius: Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael, and Botticelli. Their works adorned churches, chapels, and cathedrals, turning religious spaces into showcases of artistic brilliance. Yet this sponsorship was not without strings. Artists had to work within the boundaries set by religious authorities, adhering to approved themes and representations. A well-known example of this tension is Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. While the work is celebrated for its artistic mastery, it also sparked controversy. Some of the nude figures were considered inappropriate. In response, the Church commissioned another artist, Daniel de Volterra, to paint over the nudity with modest coverings, earning him the nickname the Breeches Maker. Sandro Botticelli experienced a more personal form of censorship. Influenced by the radical preacher Girolamo Savonarola, Botticelli took part in the infamous Bonfire of the Vanities, during which items deemed sinful or heretical were publicly burned. Among the destroyed items were books, artworks, and paintings, including some of Botticelli's own mythological creations. The Church's control over art extended to architecture and music as well. Buildings were designed to reflect spiritual hierarchy and divine order. Music had to align with liturgical functions. Any deviation from the accepted norms could be censored or outright banned. Even so, some artists and composers found ways to push boundaries subtly, embedding personal expression within acceptable frameworks. While the arts were shaped by ecclesiastical guidance, the Church's influence on science and philosophy was more combative. The Renaissance was an age of discovery, and many of the new ideas emerging during this period stood in stark contrast to religious dogma. Scientific discoveries were scrutinized, and philosophical ideas that prioritized reason over faith were met with suspicion. Nicolaus Copernicus, the Polish astronomer who first proposed the heliocentric model, delayed publishing his work out of fear of reprisal. When De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium finally appeared in 1543, it initially received little reaction. But as the implications of his theory became clear, the Church added it to the index. The heliocentric model was seen not only as a challenge to scriptural interpretation, but also as a threat to the perceived stability of the cosmos. Descartes, a foundational figure in modern philosophy, also faced difficulties. His method of radical doubt and emphasis on human reason conflicted with the Church's insistence on theological authority. Though Descartes sought to avoid controversy by moderating his writings, some of his works were placed under scrutiny. The Church's resistance to new scientific ideas delayed progress in several fields, yet it also set the stage for more open discussions about the relationship between science and religion. Eventually, the conflicts of this period would encourage calls for the separation of church and state and inspire the values that defined the Enlightenment. The Catholic Church's power was not limitless. From the 16th century onward, it began to face serious challenges. Chief among them was the Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther. Luther's critique of indulgences and clerical corruption resonated with many, leading to a major schism within Christianity. His insistence that individuals should interpret the Bible for themselves undermined the Church's claim to interpretive authority. The Reformation fragmented religious unity in Europe and led to the rise of various Protestant denominations. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, a movement that aimed to reform internal abuses and reassert its doctrines. Institutions like the Jesuits emerged to combat heresy and promote education aligned with Catholic teachings. Despite these efforts, the Church could not fully restore its former dominance. Another blow to the Church's control came with the invention of the printing press. Before Gutenberg's movable-type books were expensive and rare, often copied by hand in monasteries, the printing press democratized knowledge, allowing for mass production of texts. This made it easier to circulate reformist, scientific, and philosophical works, often in local languages rather than Latin. Humanist thought also contributed to the decline of church authority. The Renaissance ideal celebrated the potential of the individual and emphasized empirical observation and critical thinking. These ideas laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, which championed rationalism, secularism, and personal liberty. By the 18th century, the world had changed. The Enlightenment brought about revolutions in science, politics, and society. Intellectual freedom became a central value, and the role of religion in public life began to diminish. While the Church remained influential, it no longer held a monopoly over truth or knowledge. Looking back, the Catholic Church's role during the Renaissance reveals a paradox. On the one hand, it suppressed dissent and policed the boundaries of acceptable thought. On the other hand, it sponsored some of the most enduring works of art and architecture. It restricted freedom, but it also inadvertently fueled the fires of change. Today, the legacy of that era remains relevant. Questions about the limits of institutional power, freedom of expression, the relationship between faith and reason continue to resonate. As we reflect on the past, we are reminded that control over culture and knowledge is never absolute, and that the human spirit constantly seeks new ways to question, imagine, and grow. In our contemporary world, where information spreads rapidly and institutions face constant scrutiny, the Renaissance offers a powerful lens through which to understand the enduring struggle between authority and innovation. What roles do modern institutions play in shaping thought and creativity? How do we balance respect for tradition with the need for progress? These are questions as vital today as they were 500 years ago.